Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa.
Cara, this episode couldn't have come at a better time. We are interviewing Ashley Graber and Maria Evans about their book, Raising Calm Kids in a World of Worry. And the episode was recorded on the heels of the LA wildfires. And it felt fortuitous to have a new tool, a new book to use to help support kids and families during this really difficult time.
I mean, all of the triggers of anxiety have been swirling around all of us for so long, and they only feel like they're intensifying. So when the LA fires hit, it was yet another example of a situation where, in a world of worry, as they say, there was one more piece of hay on the haystack to weigh us all down. And what we talk about on this episode is really the intersection of our own stress and anxiety as parents or trusted adults who are raising these kids, coupled with their stress and anxiety. And sometimes those stressors and anxiety producers are the same, and sometimes they are different. But there's so much about how we manage our own feelings that then bleeds into how we raise them and how we teach them to cope with the things that are coming their way.
So, our two guests today are child and family psychotherapists, they're parent coaches and speakers, and they're also just lovely human beings who we believe will give you lots of reassurance as well as tools to help manage the complicated moments and our efforts to stay calm when the world doesn't feel as calm.
I mean, they're really calm, Vanessa. So we hope you enjoy this. Your shoulders will drop as you listen to this episode.
Hi, Maria. Hi, Ashley. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having us.
It's a weird thing to say, but I'm so grateful your book is in the world. And I'm sorry that the world is in a place that it so much needs your book right now. So the timing is really impeccable for very sad reasons, one of which is the recent fires in LA. And we will talk about that and sort of apply your advice and strategies to that specific scenario later in the episode. We're also in a moment of real political turmoil. A lot of what you write about and the work that you do applies to helping us all manage many of these really complex situations that are complex for both us and for our kids. So would you both just tell us a little bit about yourselves and who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Maria, and I was born in Russia and immigrated to the United States at an early age and grew up in New York City. And my career in psychotherapy really began studying the impact of toddlers who had seen 9/11, who were either in the buildings or across the street. And we did some really interesting research up at Columbia University about how children create safety in the face of trauma. And so that's really what I studied in undergrad, and then, moved on to become an LMFT and move into
Did you
work.
work with Tova Klein at
I
the Barnard?
did.
Okay.
Do you
I'm
know
like,
her?
you were interviewing her on, I don't know, in a couple weeks.
Oh, that's
and I was
awesome.
like,
Yeah.
Wait, that study sounds very, very familiar.
Yes,
Oh, that's
It was
amazing.
under Tova Klein, and she is just a phenomenal. She was my first mentor.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
And Ashley, how did you get into this work?
Yeah, so I got into this work because I was anxious as a child, and I didn't know that I was anxious as a child. And it took some time into my adulthood to really figure out what was happening for me as a kid. And once I did figure it out, I thought, well, I have to help other kids with this and parents to be aware of what's going on with their kids. And so while I was studying to become a LMFT like Maria, I was also studying mindfulness right alongside. And you all may know Elijah Goldstein. He and Stephanie were actually mentors of ours. And I heard him speak once and I thought, that's it. I'm going to blend mindfulness and psychotherapy and help kids and families and parents to understand anxiety and then have tools to help. And I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee and moved to the West Coast. And it made a whole lot of sense to do mindfulness, a lot more sense.
Everybody really needs it, don't they?
Everyone here, for sure, clearly.
Come on, you guys are all so chill and relaxed and beachy.
I know. When people say Cara Natterson, they're like, fully chill. That is so chill.
No anxiety here.
What are you talking about? I do want to just say, for full disclosure, I meditated before recording this episode. No joke. I usually end my day with that, but in honor of you guys, I started my day with that.
Excellent.
But let's talk a little bit about having discovered in hindsight that you had anxiety, that you and I want to call out that we're saying had or have anxiety as opposed to were anxious or felt anxious. We can get into that in a second. But why has all of this shifted so dramatically that when we were all growing up, we knew people who now through the retrospectoscope were clearly people who are grappling with anxiety, but not to the degree and by no means the numbers of people that we see now. Like, what has changed?
It's such a good question. Ashley and I talk about this all the time, which is it's not that we weren't anxious before, but parenting these days is completely different. When you think about the internet and you think about social media and how the 24-hour news cycle, as it's called, is now a 5-minute news cycle where every 5 minutes our phones are dinging, kids are seeing these screens. And there's also just so much more awareness about what anxiety is. And so we have a word for it, and it's not a dirty word. And so we're able to notice it and name it. So it's both good and bad, right? In the sense that the numbers really are growing. And there's so much more awareness around it that we have all these tools. I mean, Ashley and I talk all the time about how when we were young and we had anxiety, our parents didn't know how to help. And they didn't even know that there were particular tools that could help it go down.
Right. They probably told you to like suck it up, or it's not a big deal, or get over it, or get a thick skin, or whatever they said to us in the 70s and 80s that was like totally unhelpful.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Yes.
Right. Or they took you to the doctor. I mean, when I first was in practice in the early 2000s, and this is still true 25 years later, the number of kids who come in with chronic headache, chronic stomachache, chronic. And it's, through the medical lens, you have to rule out all the treatable causes before you can call it by default anxiety. And that feels like a really backwards way of going about this.
Can we give everyone a baseline definition of anxiety and contrast that, as an emotion, a normal human emotion? We don't use the word normal very often, but it's certainly, within the range of all the feelings we have. So what is anxiety, and how, because in the book you use anxiety and worry and stress and some other words sort of, interchangeably, and you talk about how and why. I want to understand sort of what we're talking about and when it's sort of stuff that just we need to learn how to manage versus when it's stuff that we need to be really concerned about.
Yeah, we did that purposefully to use the words interchangeably because we wanted to normalize anxiety in a way until it's something that needs further assistance, and we wanted parents to have a way to be able to understand it in very simple language. And that's what the first part of the book is about, is really explaining and also allowing for anxiety to um, be helped with tools that we have, but also help parents to be aware that there may be a level of it that they do need to get further assistance, and that's okay. And we talk about, we always like to say, if we didn't have some anxiety, we'd never get out of bed in the morning.
Right.
So,
Right.
so we do need a certain level of it to keep going and to keep moving. And there's also an aspect of it that is, if we didn't have some worry or fears, we would just walk into oncoming traffic or
Right.
put our hands on a hot stove. And the way we have defined it really looks at if it's interrupting a person's life, a child's life in certain ways, and that of course depends on what we're talking about, then it's really important to get extra support for it, in addition to the tools we're offering in the book.
Yeah. And, everyone can relate to a feeling of anxiety as sort of a flurry of worry that comes on all at once. And you feel it in the moment. And as child therapists, what we look at for kids is whether it's impeding daily life, that's sort of a big phrase, but what we look at is your child able to get to school in the morning and separate from you, or are they complaining of tummy aches every single day and begging to stay home? Are they able to sleep in their own bed? And are they scared to, maybe they're excited to go to a birthday party and then at the last minute they say, I just can't go, no matter how badly they wanted to, right? So we look at a lot of avoidance strategies and separation anxieties and things like that will give us a clue that it's tough. Maybe the anxiety is taking over to the level where it's impeding what they really ought to be doing, which is playing and enjoying their childhood.
And Maria, what does that look like with tweens and teens? Like, how does it sort of transform as they become more independent, and also as this? And we're going to get to the stressors in a second, but like as they evolve, as they get older, how does that present itself?
That's such a good question. So, we talk a lot about the different ways to spot anxiety, and some of them are more intuitive than others. So, in some cases, you may see repetitive behaviors, picking, skin picking, complaints of somatic things like belly aches, and those are sort of across the ages. But with tweens and teens, what you might see other than avoidance, let's say, is they may be talking about it directly, right? I can't
Hmm.
stop thinking about XYZ, or you may be hearing something on loop over and over again. And that's how you know that they're sort of consumed with a certain thought. And other times it comes out in really tricky ways. Like for a lot of people, it comes out as defiance, right?
Mhm.
Which it's can be hard to parse out because that's such a normal part of adolescence. They're supposed to get mad at you. They're supposed to resist. But sometimes kids who are highly anxious on the inside and don't know either how to say it or don't feel safe to say it, the way it comes out is either extreme isolation, where they're really, really retreating to their own spaces and getting very quiet, or the other way, which is very outwardly angry, upset.
I mean, it strikes me that there's anxiety disorder, right? That gets in the way of your life. It presents roadblocks and hurdles and is something that people feel they have to overcome until they can manage it and treat it. And then there's feeling anxious, which is one of the many typical emotional experiences we have on a daily basis. And ironically, that feeling, it almost makes me think about the prefrontal cortex and understanding consequential thinking and understanding what might happen if I do this thing and weighing that and having an emotion attached to the weight of that. And that is feeling anxious. And that is protective, right? That is the thing where we do get out of bed because we're anxious about missing a big thing that is happening that day, which is not, it is not a bad or all consuming or overwhelming emotion. And as a parent, when I take off my pediatrician hat and put on my parent hat, there were many, many instances over the course of my kids' middle and high school years where they would confuse the feeling of being anxious about something, which felt to me like a totally appropriate reaction, and having anxiety, throwing that label on. And I wonder if you can talk for a second about the power of words and language, especially with tweens and teens, and helping them to parse what is an appropriate reaction to something versus what is something that might require someone's help.
It's making me think as we were talking about this, how social media has affected the way we think about so many of these things and the way that kids think about these things. And I know Maria and I've talked about this before, where we have people come to us and they've diagnosed themselves and they don't really think about distress tolerance. That it's like kind of like a microwave distress tolerance, like we have none of it. And so to your point, Cara, that if there is one feeling, we label it something. And it doesn't necessarily mean because we feel a way a certain time that it's a label of something, or like anxiety or depression, for that matter. But that it's because there's really just this lack of ability to sit with things. And I think that's definitely goes across the ages. But when you're a kid, and certainly a tween, your life has been so short already that it does feel like almost like a big chunk of your life when something happens, when you feel this way a few times, and starting to understand that these are feelings that come and go, that even feelings of anxiety, and certainly diagnosable anxiety disorders, are something different, and how Maria described them so beautifully. But that if we can learn to sit with them for a little bit longer and learn that they're normal to have, then perhaps we don't kind of tip over into, I have something because I'm having a feeling.
So we're both normalizing that, like, we have uncomfortable feelings, and in times of transition, like puberty and adolescence and all of that stuff, we're going to have lots of uncomfortable feelings all over our bodies, our brains, our hearts, our souls. And the world, I believe, has become an increasingly complicated and stressful place. And the role of technology, social media, as you said, Maria, the 24/7 news cycle, school shootings, climate change. I mean, we are living in a really intense time, not to mention, these one-off events like the LA fires that add incredible levels of stress to people's lives. So what do you look at and think about this? You look at it and you think, this is really contributing to kid stress. Like, we talked about the increase in anxiety amongst kids. And I'm wondering, and Maria, if you want to start, what do you see as sort of major contributing factors?
Vanessa, I think you named so many of them that really plague kids right now, and parents. And I think what's really tough is that parents don't have good answers to help. They can't really answer or solve the issue of global warming, let's say, or wars, or people's identities being threatened, right? There's not really a clear answer. And so what Ashley and I have done in all of our research and all of our thinking for this book is to really identify what is the solution that we can actually point to. And what that really is, and we want you to remember this phrase, which is that calm is contagious. We want you to think about how the environment that parents set and the framing that they create around how safe the world is without being Pollyanna-ish, but just realistic. But the framing of safety is so important. And so to answer your question, a lot of the cueing that comes from the actual family is what also will contribute to the level of safety that the child feels, regardless of all of these factors that we're dealing with right now.
And can you spend a minute talking about emotional safety? Because you talk about it beautifully in the book, and it's something that we've had lots of psychologists and mental health professionals on, but what is sort of that kernel? What is at that heart of what it means to provide emotional safety to a kid?
One of the biggest things we want to think about is a place that a child can come and talk to, and a person they can talk to, and a person they can express their feelings to. And they can do that without worrying about getting in trouble or being dismissed in their feelings, and that they can have that safe sort of landing place for conversations. So that would mean that whomever the child is talking to, that the adult doesn't get too big or too small, meaning they don't overreact and they don't underreact, but really allow for the child to express what they need to and then follow up. So parents nobody has all the answers, as Maria said. And so really being able to say in moments, if the person, the parent who's in the conversation doesn't know an answer or just doesn't feel prepared for the conversation in the moment it comes up, which we know happens all the time, is to say, I don't have an answer, but I'll follow up. And to follow up, because that is that trust piece, that not only can I have this conversation, but my adult will come back to me when they say that they will, and that these conversations aren't off limits with the person that I want to, the parent, the mother, the father, the caregiver, whomever it is, that these conversations aren't off limits, whatever they are. And it could be so many things you listed, the scary things happening in the world. It could be the things happening inside their bodies, or could be something happening at school that's really scary, like drugs or sex or whatever it is, that might be a scary conversation to a parent, but they know they can come back and talk about it.
I mean, it's funny, Vanessa, you and I have had so many of these conversations as well with so many different people. And for whatever reason, it is only now dawning on me in the context of this conversation that, Ashley, to your point, social media is a universe in which nothing is off limits. It is a universe in which there are no awkward conversations because everything is right there and you can find everything. And so I've never really thought about it this way, but it strikes me that in all the advice that you give, that we give, be the parent, be the adult they can come to, tell them you're going to circle back, this, that, and the other. Maybe one of the most important things that we can do as that trusted adult is to recognize that unlike generations past, there actually is a resource for them to go to that is available 24/7, that, by the way, might have no judgment, might have a ton of judgment, might have good information, might have bad information, but no holds barred. It will go there. And that's who you're competing with. And so in an effort to, and I love the title of your book, in an effort to raise calm kids in a world of worry, when we're not talking about younger kids, but when we're looking at tweens and teens, and we're thinking about not just their inner world, but their virtual world, which we really don't have eyes on. We really don't have a sense of what is flying at them all the time. It is really hard to keep your kids' feet planted and their brains sort of slowly spinning on an axis instead of swirling, right? If all these things are coming at them that used to be in the realm of the child-adult relationship, and now live in that realm, sure, but lots of other realms too. Does this make sense? Am I just having a moment?
It's such a good point, and it's just making me think of all of the teens that come into this office, and I would have to say the majority of teens that I speak to will readily admit without any shame that they know so much more than their parents realize. They'll say, "Oh, my mom has no idea that I know all about XYZ, or that I watch these videos, or that I have this information, and I'd never go to her because why would I need to?" Right? So,
Right.
when we talk about emotional safety, you bring up a good point, and it's not necessarily so much that you're the one with the answers, but it's about being that realistic parent that goes, "You know what? I know you have access to all this stuff." And being the safe person in the relationship. And so that's a
Mm.
different a little bit of a pivot, but it's probably worth mentioning, which is that I think all of us can relate to feeling like our parent was either anxious, angry, or very down and depressed, and we
Mhm.
couldn't talk to them about it. And we couldn't bring their own parenting style to them and say, "Hey,
Mm.
this is the impact that you're having on me."
Mm.
And that wasn't really a conversation that most people could have. And so, one way that parents now that we coach parents to establish emotional safety with preteens and teens and kids of all ages is to be the parent that can hear that. How do you become a safe parent, right? It's to be the parent that can hear their child say, "Hey, that was really hard when you yelled at me when I got home. I didn't like that. It made me feel uncomfortable." And to be the parent that can go, "Yeah, I bet that didn't feel good."
Yeah, but let's acknowledge too, I think it's really important that as the parent, sometimes things feel really bad. And it's harder to say to the kid in the scenario, I didn't like how that felt because we're so worried about their emotional safety. And so as they get, one of the gifts of kids getting older and getting better at communicating is that the two-way street of that conversation gets better. But when you're talking about grammar school kids and middle school kids, it is so true. Like sometimes the parent just has to be the receptacle of that. And that's really hard.
Mhm. It is. It is. And to uh, touch a little bit more, Cara, on what you were saying about this sort of competition that you're up against with social media and taking in all of the things that kids are saying. There are these years that we will tell parents. If a child goes to school and you keep hearing from the school they're doing great and they're so sweet and they're coming home and they're absolutely coming apart at home, we will often say, well, you're the safe person.
Mhm.
And it's true. You are the safest person for them to show their sort of underbelly to, their softer side of their underbelly to. And the things that we had to think about in years past and that parents had to think about as far as what's coming, what information is coming in and what you're up against. There was no social media. There was no news cycle. It was, we had to either go to our parents or not go to our parents.
Mhm.
And I would imagine that if we had, if parents didn't have that today, that there would actually be a lot less worry in children because they wouldn't be taking in all of this information. And then, as you said, Cara, that you wouldn't be so worried all the time about what it is that you're saying to them or what it is they're learning in different places. It just would be, I feel so old when I say things like this, but it just would be simpler.
It was a simpler time.
Well, but
it was a simpler time.
Ashley, I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago about topics that are off limits in
Mhm.
families, because when we grew up, that was very much the case, right? There were topics that were not discussed. And I'm sure each of us is thinking of 3 or 4 of those topics right now. And every family is different and the community you grew up in and the culture. But there are still times where adults now, even with all this access to information and streaming services and social media and Google searches and kids on Chromebooks all day and all of that, there are still topics that adults, caregivers, teachers are concerned about talking to kids about, right? Because they can be big, they can be scary. I mean, there's topics that I'm thinking about right now that I am choosing not to talk to my own kids about because I'm like, oh God, they don't need more on their plate. They've got enough on their plate. I don't want to burden them. How do we walk the line between sort of, as you said, Maria, earlier, like kind of protecting them from some stuff while also having them be in the world, not sort of inadvertently conferring shame on topics because we're trying to keep them safe? Like, how do we navigate? How do we figure out what to talk about, what not to talk about, and in what way to talk about it?
We often will talk about age-appropriate conversations, and that can be kind of difficult to figure out what's age-appropriate. One of the tips that we'll often give, which is really helpful, is to lead with curiosity. So if there is something that feels really big and really hard to have a conversation about, to ask what they know and start there. Because so often, and we can do this in conversations with kids, we can do this in our lives, we get nervous and then we overtalk.
Yep.
And, and we forget what children will know and what they don't know. And I think one of the hardest things, and Vanessa, you just spoke to it, is there's so much we know as adults about any given topic. And so when we think about talking to kids about something, we kind of go with how much we know in our heads about it, and a lot of nuance about any given topic. So if we can start with curiosity, and one of the questions we'd love to ask is, if there's something that's happened immediately, is what are your friends talking about? And certainly asking if there's any questions. And when we talk about having difficult conversations, we teach parents in the book how to not only set themselves up for it, but also to take cues from their kids. So you may go into a conversation thinking like, oh, this is such a big conversation. And a child just kind of like, says whatever about it and moves on, or they're just not interested in having the conversation in that moment. And to watch, because you may not have to have such a big conversation all at once, which is helpful to the adult, because then you can take a breather and kind of walk away. Whew, didn't have to have that whole conversation the way I imagined it.
And don't be alarmed too. The other thing we tell parents all the time is don't be alarmed if your child isn't having the super deep empathic response that you would hope for them to have. They're naturally egocentric. They're going through a completely different phase than we are. So if you tell them some really great big news that they might have heard on a headline and say, hey, we should really talk about this, and they seem kind of blasé about it, don't be alarmed, because that may be their way of creating safety for themselves, which sounds like this. If I'm okay and my family's okay, I don't care that much about it. And that doesn't mean they're going to grow up to be unempathic beings, so long as you see empathy in other places popping up once in a while. It may just be a way they're protecting themselves.
So let's circle back to the Los Angeles fires for a second. Maria and I are both locals. Ashley was in Los Angeles. This is something that is very close to our own hearts, but also has huge ripples in terms of the work that you do, in terms of the work that we do. The questions we get are largely about biological and physiological impacts of VOCs and all these other toxins, and, worry around sort of direct effects, and then also worry around worry, right? And what are the biological consequences of that? The questions you get are much more skewed towards the latter, I would imagine. How, when anyone goes through a scary or worrying event, a trauma, a natural disaster, whatever major event in their life, being calm is not it's not the adaptive response in the moment. That's not. So sometimes I think we tell ourselves holding it together is success when we come up against these things. What is the healthiest way? Is there a healthiest way for people to manage worries that are overwhelming? I mean, the LA fires were overwhelming. Is the goal calm? Is that the long-term goal? Is that the short-term goal? And what are the steps that you generally see that people can take to get there?
So, what we know from disaster response is that every little bit of calm that you can access just in the very moment that you're in adds up. And to answer your question, the ultimate goal of calm may be a little bit too lofty of a goal. We had to we told so many parents over the last month or so, it's okay that your child saw you feeling anxious. It's okay that you were stressed. It's okay that you yelled. These parents, we talk about repair a lot. It's okay later to say, I was really anxious. Were you anxious? That's an experience that we all get. And we saw so many different responses to the fires. Everybody was having what we would call a normal response to an abnormal event, a normal response. It's normal to be anxious. It's normal to have nightmares after an experience like that. It's normal to have fears popping up about the future. And on the parenting end, we talk about modeling, which is how do you model a sense of, I may be anxious right now, but I know we're going to figure it out. I may be anxious right now, but I can tell you the next step for the very next day, even though we don't know where we're going to live next week, right? We know that tonight we're staying here. And so I hope that helps give just a sense of how you might handle the moment by moment with kids and teens, even when you're in the midst of a trauma yourself. And it's okay to feel. It's important to feel.
What shouldn't parents say or do? Like we're super constructive and we love to say all the positive stuff, but sometimes there's a place for whatever the opposite of prescriptive advice is. Non-prescriptive advice. I don't know what the inverse is. But Maria, what are some things you say it in this really nice, calm voice. So maybe it'll come off as less jarring to people. But there are ways that we screw up, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's not permanent damage, God willing, hopefully, but we do screw up. We do hurt our kids' feelings. We do overreact. What are some sort of typical parent mess ups that we should strive not to do in the future?
So I bet Ashley and I could go back and forth with this one and have a pretty fun time with it. We call these roadblocks in our book. What are the parenting roadblocks and how do you look out for them? So I'll start with catastrophizing. What you don't want to do is go to your kid and say, the absolute worst thing just happened and you can't imagine what might happen next. And just take them through the absolute catastrophe of what you think might happen. You don't want to future cast into some terrible existence that you imagine. And we all do it, right? We all catastrophize, but you want to keep that away from the kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I might have mentioned a little bit of this before, but the dismissing as well of feelings, and that can be something that can be really hard in the midst of something dramatic going on, or just in the midst of a busy day, or a child who has a lot of feelings, which I'm sure we relate to, but dismissing as well feelings, and that's that sort of don't worry about it, or don't make such a big deal out of it, whatever it might be.
I will chime in that I messed that one up during the fires. I had my 21-year-old was still home on her holiday break from college, and she was following the news as closely as I was. She was on all the apps just like I was, and her alarm bells, her internal alarm bells, were going off appropriately. And I was trying to be really calm. I was trying to do all the things and stay, level-headed and figure out where was the risk and how real was this? And, when do you jump in your car? And, how do you manage the dogs and the kids and the stuff, and you're packing all the photos in your car, and you're getting incoming from all your friends who are living in different parts of the city, and you just don't know, should you, to Maria's earlier point, should you be catastrophizing more? Are you being inappropriate by not catastrophizing? And so what did I do? Ashley, I dismissed. And for the first several hours, I spent a lot of time and energy saying, it's fine. It's okay. You know, this is really okay. And finally, she called me out and said, we're not okay. And she said, I get it that, you know, news is designed to get eyeballs, but this is not what's going on. And I am not comfortable anymore. And I do think that it was a really interesting moment for me as a parent, because she was very much a kid at the moment, but she's an adult, right? And I got to get sort of checked in the moment, and I got to press reset. She was doing something that Vanessa and I obsessively talk about, which is explaining her why. This was why it was not okay for me to not engage in what was going on around me, because she was feeling an existential threat. And as soon as she explained why, I stopped dismissing and I said, let's pack the car.
So Cara, you just beautifully demonstrated emotional safety as a parent, right? That alone that would be our definition right there.
So in response to Cara's scenario, you guys talk about something called echoing as kind of a tool in the toolbox to manage like exactly that situation and many others. Can you talk about what echoing is and why it's so effective? And when I was reading it, it reminded me of when I used to walk through to get to sports practice. We would walk through a tunnel. I would walk through this tunnel under the highway with my kids, and we would do that echo, and it sort of never got old. And no matter how old they got, they still wanted to do it. And it, so it brought that
fun.
It brought back like a really beautiful, lovely, connected memory. And then I was like, oh, good. Maybe that memory will actually help me remember to use this tool instead of the 10 I shouldn't use. So Maria, can you talk a little bit about echoing?
Of course. Yeah, that's a great visual. So exactly that. In our book, we talk about how do you get your kids to start talking and not stop? How do you get them to talk to you and not clog the drain? So what you do is whatever they share, and we use this tool as psychotherapists all the time. We try to pack in all of our therapy tools in there, is your child is talking to you and you echo back just a few of the words or a paraphrase of the words. But the key is, and this is what we were talking about before, is you don't want to be super calm and monotone if they're coming up here, right? So if they're coming home and saying, I can't believe she did that to me, and then she didn't sit next to me at lunch, and she's just the worst friend in the world. If you sit there like a therapist and you go, she's the worst friend in the world, that sounds really hard. They're going to want to kill you, right? You have to go, she didn't sit with you at lunch.
She's the worst.
And that's all you have to say. She didn't sit with you at lunch. And then, the teen will say, yeah, and then this happened. That happened, right? So you want to imagine echoing like it's an emotional echoing. You're responding. And Kari, that would have been something that would have been nice to try. And, next time you can is
next time the city's on fire.
Use your tools. We're looking for an A+ here. So, if somebody's
you
panicking,
understand me.
We know as therapists too, in trauma work, if somebody's in a traumatic state, sitting there super calm can actually be really dysregulating for that patient, right? So
That's exactly right.
You need to kind of match their energy a little bit without catastrophizing.
And yet, I will throw in this wrench, which is, and this sort of ties together the whole conversation, especially for people with older kids who are on devices, whether it's social media or other news channels that are coming their way. There's a lot of catastrophizing that is thrown at them in what you guys described as the 5-minute news cycle. Totally agree with that description. It's brilliant. I have not heard that before. And it is very, very hard to help them figure out what is real and what is not. And in particular, we are recording this in late February of 2025. We are 1 month into a new administration where a lot has happened in the last month, to say the least. And that is not catastrophization. That is, I mean, there is a fire hose of change that is coming at all of us. And that is a lot to handle. And so there are all these factors. Is there a solution to parenting through that when the onslaught is real and when the just the sheer volume of what's coming at not just us, but our kids as well? How do we remain calm?
This is a question we get so much. And as you said, it's just even more so now because there is so much that is changing and so much that is happening. And one of the things that we try to remind parents of is, and I think Maria might have said this earlier, you're not going to change it and you're not going to be able to solve it. And so parenting through it might mean what you did, Cara, before you came on here, which is to take a few deep breaths, to use, and this is a big ask when you're a busy person, but to use tools that you have when thinking about these conversations, but certainly when having them or when your child is coming to you with them. And one of the things that we love to tell parents is you can always say, I don't have an answer to that. And I think I might have mentioned it earlier, and come back to it. Because if you get caught off guard, then what happens is our brain flips, and then we don't have connection to the reasoning and rationing part of our brain, and everything starts to feel bigger. Now, these are real things, and it's real big things we're talking about. But if we don't have that some state of calm on the inside and have our brain somewhat connected, it is going to feel like there is no way to walk through some of these conversations. And so we have a lot that we give as suggestions, but it's really trying things out for yourself and finding what is the way that you can feel most grounded to sit in any kind of conversation, knowing that you aren't going to fix it, but that you can be there to be the safe place for your child to talk to about the things happening.
And on the flip side, if they don't seem to care or they don't seem worried, to your point earlier, Maria, like it doesn't mean they're a sociopath. It just may mean they've figured out a way to protect themselves emotionally during this chaos. So the temptation is to be like, what do you mean you're not reading about this? What do you mean you're not upset about this? How are you not talking about this in school? That's terrible. Right?
Said both of us this week.
Those may be direct quotes from each of us in our own homes. And by the way, this was not pre-planned. This is totally coincidental that we said all of those things. And yet, Maria, I think you're framing, and I'd love to land here, that like we also can have faith in our kids and trust our kids that they will begin to learn what tools they need and strategies they need to keep themselves emotionally safe, particularly as they become more and more independent and maybe even physically not living near us, but at the very least kind of out in the world a lot more. So I find that really helpful because sometimes I get a little bit judgy that my children are not as worried or concerned as I am. Just a little bit. Say what we do, what we say, not what we do. Right, Cara? That's our philosophy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we really want to let them have their childhood. And
yes,
that is so hard to do right now with what's weighing on us. But if they have figured out a way to have their childhood, despite everything that's going on, and they get to be excited about friends and worried about who's saying what rather than the news, this is a good thing. We want to let their adaptive brains do their thing, right? And in terms of, I mean, ideally, they're not coping through being on their phones all the time. And we do want to model that, which is get them outside, get them in nature, get them moving their bodies. I know you guys talk about that a lot. And also as parents, really modeling those things, that's important. Making sure that for us too, not putting our phones down for 30 minutes a night and just being present. If you can get them to play a game with you, a board game. Some parents can, some parents can't, but pull out a new card game, see if they'll do it. These things are coping strategies that go a really long way. Teens get really excited to learn that, doing a Sudoku puzzle will help bring their calm, or anything really to do with the prefrontal cortex. Any time that you're thinking about something in a logical way, it brings you into the present. And so really empowering them to find the things that work for them and being creative about it. And yes, trusting them to find it too.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you listening who are skeptical that teens can come up with those things, we are all here to tell you they are eminently capable of giving you a list of 10 or 20 things that they love to do that brings them calm.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that no one ever asks them.
Mm.
And they will blow you away. I mean, we've sat in auditoriums with hundreds of teenagers and like the hands are up left and right. I'm sure Maria and Ashley, in your work and your practice, they come up with some awesome ideas. So if you're worrying about how your kid is managing and finding calm, ask them some things that they do now
That's right.
that work. And maybe some of us can even borrow their strategies.
100%.
Thank you both for coming on. Thank you for putting this beautiful book out into the world at such a poignant moment in time. And it's really wonderful. And thank you for all the work you do with kids and families. It's so appreciated.
Thank you. Likewise, we really respect the work that you do.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. What a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.